Throughout the 1990s, Sonic the Hedgehog was firmly established as one of the most iconic game series of all time. Sega had wanted a mascot of their own to compete with Nintendo's beloved Mario, and had managed to put up quite a fight. While their 16-bit console, the Genesis, had initially failed to capture a large chunk of the market, that began to turn around with the arrival of Sonic. With unique physics-based gameplay, a phenomenal world and cast of characters that continually expanded with each game, an attention-grabbing marketing campaign, and next-gen visuals and sound, Sonic stood out from his contemporaries and even managed to kickstart the popularity of the animal platforming mascot. The series would keep on growing with every game, culminating in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which is where I'd say Sonic became something truly special. It was a phenomenal video game with scale, ambition, polish, replayability, and so much more all rolled into one. Without a doubt, my pick for the best game on the Sega Genesis, just an absolute work of art. At that point, they had pretty much peaked as far as 16-bit Sonic goes. That said, Sega and Sonic teams still wanted more. They wanted Sonic to continue being an incredible icon that broke new boundaries in the industry. However, things wouldn't work out so well following Sonic 3. Financial problems caused by poor business decisions, as well as several mediocre releases from Sonic, threatened to halt Sega's momentum in its tracks. But then something happened that would give them a second chance. Enter the 3D era of video game consoles. Left and right, legacy franchises were all making the switch to exciting new polygonal graphics, including Mario, Zelda, Metal Gear, Castlevania, Pac-Man, and so many more. In addition, several new franchises designed from the ground up in the new dimension would enter the ring. Star Fox, Quake, Half-Life, Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, the competition was fierce. I must be honest, while the games from this era certainly have their problems and have often aged considerably, I have an undeniable soft spot for them. The time period just has this feeling of nostalgia to it, even if I was born well after the 3D craze had already more or less run its course. In fact, the few games that came out around this time remain some of my favorites. Can anyone say Super Mario 64? Regardless, Sega knew that they had to join in on the madness themselves, giving their Blue Blur some much needed new life. With their own 5th gen console, the Saturn, getting ready to release, the Sega Technical Institute began development on the first ever 3D Sonic game, Sonic Extreme. And it was an absolute disaster. If you thought the development troubles Sonic 2 and 3 suffered from were harsh, they were absolutely nothing in comparison to Extreme. If you want to get more detail, I'd recommend this video by Stuff We Play, but long story short, company politics once again disrupted the natural flow of development, and the lead devs would crunch on the project so hard that they grew seriously ill. Cutting their losses, Sega decided to cancel the game, and instead released a port of Sonic 3D Blast for the Saturn. This whole fiasco led to the closure of Sega Technical Institute, and above all else, it left the Saturn without an original mainline Sonic game, which was really damaging for the platform's success. What certainly didn't help was the competition that arose. Back in 1993, Nintendo had forsaken Sony in a deal for a CD-based SNES add-on, instead partnering with Philips for their CDI. The company had actually later tried to partner with Sega, meeting with Tom Kalinske, but he harshly turned them down, supposedly claiming that Sony had no idea how to make either hardware or software. Enraged from how they had been treated by both companies, Sony decided to take matters into their own hands and thus created the PlayStation, a powerful new CD-based console to directly compete with the Sega Saturn and the cartridge-based Nintendo 64. In retaliation to Sega's denial, maybe, it's way cooler if that's true, Sony humiliated Sega by using their own tactics against them, in one of the most infamous moments in E3 history.
$299.
The PlayStation was also much cheaper than the Saturn, which retailed for, get this, $399. Absolute savages, those Sony executives. That was pretty much the kiss of death for the Saturn. Along with there being no new major Sonic game to demonstrate the system's capabilities, the PlayStation had generally more appealing software, and above all else, it was way cheaper, and even capable of playing music CDs. Sega sunk into even greater financial depression, and watched this new rival they had helped create dominate the industry for the next several years. They needed a new Sonic game to help turn the tides again, and they needed it quick. The Saturn was a lost cause, so Sega began R&D on another new console, which they aimed to get a head start on the next generation with. In comes the Sega Dreamcast, the first console released in the illustrious 6th generation, which gets my personal pick for the best one in gaming history. I'll admit, it may have something to do with nostalgia for the chunky graphics, since I did grow up with some PS2 games, and they're right on the threshold between old and new, but there's just something so profoundly cool about this area of the industry. I guess it was the last time period before the era of realistic graphics, paid DLC, and microtransactions, but I think it really has something to do with how earnest everything felt. I suppose that's the best way to describe it. The best video games from this time period, to me anyway, didn't feel like they were created with any cynical business incentives or profit motives in mind, and were made with the intent to be satisfying rather than addictive. I don't know, it's hard to put into words, and I don't want to generalize because there's good and bad games from every era, regardless of the circumstances behind them, but that's just the impression I get from the 6th generation. A more valid reason for me, however, it's just that so many of my favorite games, especially from several of my most loved series, come from this generation. In any event, enough about me. How does this concern Sonic? Well, Sega saw their new system as the perfect opportunity opportunity to make an impact with their flagship series yet again. And so development on the next big title began, fittingly named Sonic Adventure. Interestingly, Sonic Adventure was actually not intended to be a platformer at first, but rather an RPG. Yeah, so that awful Sonic Chronicles game on the DS, it was almost usurped a decade before it even existed as an idea. Sega had wanted to expand the story and world of Sonic since the very beginning, and an RPG would have allowed them to do that in spades. However, this eventually changed back to a platformer to more closely replicate the style of gameplay Sonic had already been established with. Development had originally started on the Saturn, where Sonic Team developed the prototype. Once they found out about the Dreamcast, though, they switched development to take advantage of its greater capabilities, instead using their Saturn prototype as a bonus in Sonic Jam. Sonic Adventure had a huge development team, with as many as 100 devs in total working on it, and it was so intertwined with the creation of the Dreamcast itself that Takashi Iizuka, the game's producer, actually convinced Sega to give the system more RAM just for the purposes of running the game more smoothly. It was an ambitious project and sought to both replicate the series' gameplay style faithfully in the third dimension, and expand on it considerably. In the end, almost 300 developers would wind up working on this game at some point, and many team members had even traveled to temples, jungles, and Mesoamerican ruins to give the game a more grounded feel and show off the Dreamcast's advanced hardware. When the game was unveiled at the 1998 Tokyo International Forum, people were impressed. When it came out in December 1998 in Japan, and later on in 1999 elsewhere after being translated into English by the newly formed Sonic Team USA, the game received critical acclaim. Initially, the Dreamcast was actually doing rather well and managed to ship 1.5 million units in 1999. Sonic Adventure, being a System Star launch title and all, would go on to be its top seller. At the time, people were blown away by the game. Sure, you had some older fans who were put off by it, as with any series that experiences a huge change like this, but for the most part, it seems like the game was rather well received. In more recent times, though, the consensus has kind of drifted to be more mixed. Ask someone what they think of Sonic Adventure, and you're bound to get a different response for every person. Some people still really like this game, while others don't. Some will tell you it's a fun time that's just aged poorly, some love the entire thing unconditionally, some consider it a fundamental failure, and some think it's full of good ideas that were poorly executed. I don't mean to call anyone out in particular, or anyone at all really. I just mean to illustrate that 3D Sonic has always been far more divisive than its older 2D brethren, and that's for a multitude of reasons. As for me, I first played Sonic Adventure in 2019. Following my playthrough of Sonic CD that summer, I was in a Sonic mood yet again, and decided I was tired of only having the Genesis games to play. I wanted to expand my horizons with the series, so I picked up a Dreamcast along with its Sonic games to get a taste of the series' 3D titles. Part of me was curious as I had heard about the game's polarizing reception, and so wanted to see what it was all about, but another part was really excited because what I had seen of the Dreamcast Sonic games seemed really interesting to me, like something I would really enjoy. After all, I'm a sucker for 3D platforming games. Admittedly, I did begin with the game's sequel, which I was more personally excited to play, but eventually got to the first one when I had finished that game up. Over the years, I've come back to this game more than once, including when I picked up its GameCube and PC ports the following year. For me, it's always been a solid Sonic experience that I can kick back and have some fun with. I've always had some issues with it, but overall, it was a game I could come back to and enjoy my time with. I don't return to it quite as often as many other games in this series, for a few reasons that should become evident by video's end, but all in all, Sonic Adventure is a game I've always had fun with despite its flaws. So why don't we quit beating around the bush and jump right in to answer that, kind of pointless question I posed in the video's title. I'm just realizing. Son of a bitch. As soon as you start the game up, you can tell that Sonic Team was going all out for this one. Sonic games had already been expanding with every last entry, getting bigger and bigger with each one, and nowhere was that more true than in the case of Sonic Adventure. The game opens up with a loud and proud CG cutscene, showing off the characters' new looks. This intro may not seem like much today, the CG models for the characters are kind of dated, and in general it looks very 90s, but I still really like this intro for what it is. It has crazy editing, the game's main theme blasting, and in general it really gets you hyped up for the journey to follow. Also, mentioning the characters' designs reminds me, Sonic Adventure also features an all-new art style for the series cast. Sonic Team thought the old designs were becoming a bit outdated, and in general they found Sonic to be too short to be represented by a 3D model, so they commissioned redesigns for the cast from artist Yuji Uekawa. The characters were made taller, more sophisticated, and were given colorful new eyes to reflect who they were. I can't begin to tell you how much I love this art style, seriously. Even to this day, it looks really clean and appealing, all the while having a late 90s, early 2000s graffiti edge to it. It's most evident with the game's original box art on Dreamcast, which features Sonic in this cheeky pose striking a confident grin. It's almost like he's telling the player to move it or lose it, sort of like he did on the title screens of the Genesis games, except in an even more visually captivating way due to his new appearance. All this applies to the in-game menus as well. While yes, they are kind of simple and static by today's standards, they're rocking this really neat Y2K aesthetic that features a really pleasant sky background. I can say the same thing about the game's actual graphics. While sure, you can tell that it was made in the late 1990s, I personally find its aesthetic appealing, despite despite the fact that it was the first ever true 3D Sonic game. As I mentioned in the intro, Sonic Adventure clearly wanted to go for a somewhat more realistic approach, which to me is fairly logical, since the series always wanted to be more grounded than other platformers with their zany, dreamlike settings. The textures are about as photorealistic as they could make them back then, the colors are more naturalistic, stuff like that. That being said, there's still plenty of creativity to go around. Take Windy Valley for example. It's a cluster of floating land somewhere high in the sky, with metal walkways and ancient ruins up the wazoo. Also, even though some levels may rely on tropey themes, such as Ice Cap or even the opening stage Emerald Coast, they're done in a way that feels distinct and visually engaging to me, preventing them from being boring or tiresome to look at. Emerald Coast, Speed Highway, and Red Mountain in particular have some of my favorite visuals in the game. Emerald Coast is this gorgeous beach area complete with a resort, palm trees, and rocky overhangs. Speed Highway is a roadway set at night, which eventually transitions to a peaceful city at the break of dawn. And Red Mountain is an expansive mountain range that also sees you traveling into an area full of volcanic activity. It sets us on Angel Island, that's probably very close to Lava Reef Zone. Also, you can't go wrong with Hot Shelter and Final Egg, both of which feature an industrial aesthetic, fitting for being Eggman's bases. I also think the character models look decent for a Dreamcast launch game, have solid animations during gameplay, and replicate Yuji Uekawa's character art decently well, although not quite perfectly yet. In general, I think this game is appealing visually, even if it's aged a bit in terms of polygon count or texture quality. However, if I had to nitpick something, there is quite a bit of plate and pop-in, although I'm willing to overlook this since this was a Dreamcast launch title, and I don't find it all that noticeable while playing anyway. By contrast though, the cutscene presentation has aged quite a bit to say the least. To be fair, I appreciate this game's willingness to tell a more in-depth story. Previous games had done this to the best of their ability, but were fairly limited in what they could do because, well, they were Genesis games. Meanwhile, here on the Dreamcast, we've got real-time cutscenes with full voice acting and more complex animation. This was the most plot a Sonic game had seen back then, and I admired the effort, especially since I think Sonic's cast of characters and the world it takes place in lends itself to such a story. I also find it cool how the various parts of the game essentially serve as the different characters' perspectives on the same events, since it makes this story feel more complete. However, I don't want to be unfair because this game did come out in 1998, but the presentation of this plot is noticeably dated. Rather than featuring original animations for the cutscenes, the characters instead recycle gameplay animations repeatedly to simulate more complex motions, and it looks about as stiff as you might expect. On top of that, the facial animations are, well, I think the footage I'm showing kinda speaks for itself. I won't toss a chair over it, since, again, 1998, but it's hard for me to take the cutscenes seriously when they look like this, which I imagine is what the writers intended given how many cutscenes the game has. Additionally, the scenes are also paced and edited in a sluggish manner, often with large awkward spaces between lines.
By that.
It unfortunately obfuscates a lot of the story, because it's so outwardly noticeable and distracting. With all that said, I wouldn't say this game's presentation has aged much worse than many of its contemporaries. Honestly, this sort of shit was fairly commonplace back then, especially since most games were translated on the cheap, even if they did attempt more ambitious stories. There was also no clearly established quality standard yet, and so most companies were forced to essentially experiment through trial and error in earnest anyway. If anything, like I said, I think the fact that they tried to do this in Sonic Adventure is appreciable, because you didn't see this kind of thing in platformers back then. At the very least, the data presentation is able to give me a fair few laughs too, because I just find it charming in a way, and Sonic & Company's characterization is enhanced by the addition of the voice acting. Speaking of Sonic, why don't we finally get into the game itself and discuss how that plays? When starting a new file, we can see a few characters in this wheel-like menu, but from the start, Sonic is unsurprisingly the only one selectable. Upon selecting his campaign, we're immediately loaded into a semi-realistic city. This is Station Square, and it's one of the primary settings we'll be going through. All seems well, and it's a clear night. Sonic is seen hopping around the city's rooftops, and takes a quick break to gaze out over the open city.
Oh yeah! This is happening!
Suddenly he hears something in the distance, and decides to go check it out with nothing better to do. We then catch a glimpse of what's going on. A mysterious water monster has made its way into the city, which is cornered by a bunch of police officers. They open fire on the creature, but this does nothing, so the officers flee the scene. That is before Sonic comes in. Recognizing this monster as a potential threat, he takes it on in an extremely easy boss fight. Yeah, oddly enough, the first ever bit of 3D Sonic gameplay is a boss, and a piss easy one at that. After that's done with, the creature reforms itself into a puddle and escapes through a sewer drain.
Come on, you big drip! Where you going?
Cue Dr. Eggman observing from a nearby rooftop as he spouts out one of the greatest lines in gaming. No. Cinematic history.
You know nothing, fool! It's Chaos, the god of destruction!
That was the late Dean Bristow doing Eggman's voice, and he's definitely my favorite actor for the character. He just puts his all into it, and manages to capture the menacing yet still comical villain's personality so perfectly. I also consider Ryan Drummond, Sonic's voice actor, my favorite actor for his respective character. He's always been the best fits for Sonic's personality, if you ask me, managing to expertly portray the Hedgehog's youthful attitude and desire to do what he feels is right. These guys would definitely grow into their roles over time, but even in SA1, I find their performances really entertaining. In any case, that sure was weird. It seems like Eggman's uncovered something in the time between Sonic 3 and now, and seems to have made some sort of alliance with Chaos. Sonic leaves for now, making sure to keep an eye on what the Doctor's up to. Upon waking the next morning, Sonic witnesses his best friend Tails testing the propulsion system for the new plane he's been building, the Tornado 2. The test doesn't go very well.
Watch out! You're gonna crash! Ah!
Realizing his friend needs help, Sonic sets off for him, thus beginning Emerald Coast, the first proper action stage in the game. And with that, I can finally get to discussing what Sonic Adventure is like as a gameplay experience. When it comes to transitioning a game franchise to 3D, there's two primary approaches a developer can take. They could either try and directly translate the previous game's mechanics into the third dimension, or do something new entirely. Since 2D and 3D are so fundamentally different, there's usually at least some degree of reinvention going on. So it's up to the designers how much they want to attempt to accurately recreate the gameplay of old in the new dimension. Therefore, most franchises tended to go with a hybrid approach, which is squarely where Sonic Adventure lies. Bringing this series into 3D was always going to be a challenge due to its high speeds, but I'd say they stuck the landing fairly well, all things considered. In fact, if you want my humble opinion, I would argue that Sonic actually works a little better in 3D than he does in 2D. That might be something of a hot take, possibly, I'm not totally sure, but it's my take. For one, we're now given full 3D movement in an open space, complete with a free-moving camera. This right here is the number one reason why I think this series' gameplay inherently works better in 3D. Remember how I criticized the 2D Sonic games, to varying degrees granted, but still, for screen crunch issues? Because of Sonic's high speeds, it wasn't out of the question that players would slam into the stage hazards and enemies they couldn't see. Because of the 320x224 resolution of the Genesis, the lack of camera panning, and occasionally dickish enemy placement. It's the kind of thing that becomes less of an issue the more you play the games, doubly so if you play the definitive fan projects that give each game full widescreen. But even as an experienced player, I sometimes still end up running into things that come flying from off screen. Now, I'll admit that I wasn't as practiced as I could have been in the playthroughs of those games, and I still enjoy those games in spite, but my point is that I don't think these things should happen in the first place. That's where the 3D transition of Sonic Adventure comes in to save the day. With a camera that now follows Sonic from behind, enemies have no chance to fly in out of nowhere and hit you without warning. Bottomless pits are also immediately obvious, so there's no chance you'll fall into one without expecting it either. Granted, the game does have some camera issues of its own, and it sometimes gets stuck on walls and the like, but even the best games from back then had some sort of struggle with this. With that in mind, I still think the camera in this game is more than functional. It's usually automatic, and if you do ever need to change the angle, the shoulder buttons provide continuous rotation. About as good as you can get on a controller with only one analog stick. On the whole, the improved visibility this provides leads to a more smooth gameplay experience for me, and I already found the Genesis games to be fairly smooth experiences, so yeah. That said, speaking of smooth gameplay, Sonic's controls are some of the best from one of these old 3D platformers. That's pretty impressive considering it was their first real try at a game like this, and yet they absolutely nailed it. Sonic can get up to a satisfying speed, but at the same time he accelerates very gradually. Conversely, when you snap the stick back to neutral, he naturally slows down to a stop rather than instantly halting on a dime, unless you pull back, which causes him to instantly turn around as expected. Sonic's turning in general is really smooth and responsive, which makes tight turns at high speeds really easy to do. Jumping is also responsive. I wish I could describe it with a new word, but you know, I'm not very good at coming up with those. You can get a lot of height the longer you hold the button down, which I get as a standard mechanic in platforming games, but this is one of the best implementations of it I've seen. Sonic's air control is also really solid, letting you control his trajectory without it being overly sensitive. Additionally, Sonic now has a homing attack, which makes it easier to target enemies in 3D. This move was also in 3D Blast, but there it was a power-up. Here it's a part of Sonic's base moveset. If you don't target an enemy, Sonic will instead do an air dash, which can be used to cross a gap that's just a little too wide for a standard jump. Personally, I enjoy using this attack, particularly when they let you rapidly chain it together on a trail of enemies, and the air dash comes in handy for me on numerous occasions throughout the game. Altogether, movement in this game is really fun for me. It's fast, satisfying, just a great time altogether. What really makes it a blast to play, though, is how the spin dash was implemented. Instead of previous games, where you'd have to come to a stop to use it, in this game you can activate it with only one button, and while on the move to boot. It also takes a lot less time to charge up, so in many cases you're able to rapidly chain spin dashes together to quickly cross large stretches of level design. That's awesome. On top of that, you can also jump out of a spin dash, which can be used to take shortcuts if you properly take advantage of the physics. Sure, this could also be done in the previous games, but I find it way more doable and not to mention even more fun in Sonic Adventure. I could list numerous examples examples. In the opening section of Ice Cap, you usually have to use these numbered pads to reach a higher ledge, and go through a short section to reach the level's next area, but if you climb this slope, you can line up a spin dash jump to get to said area much quicker. In Twinkle Park, if you line yourself up on the sloped roof correctly, you can spin dash and time a jump to go flying into the air, letting you reach the walkway above, entirely skipping a short section on the ground that leads up there. See what I mean? This game is packed to the brim with opportunities to do stuff like this, and it makes you feel like a badass to pull such things off. I don't really know what else to say. I love how Sonic controls in this game, and it makes taking advantage of the terrain really fun. Another thing I really love about Sonic's gameplay in this game is the level design. Admittedly, it's not as tightly designed as Sonic 3 was, since you are able to take so many shortcuts, but that's honestly something I love about the game. Also, with how deliberately these setups appear sometimes, I have a hard time believing they weren't at least a little bit intentional. Irrespective of that, I find these levels pretty well crafted overall. I think they play really well with Sonic's controls, even if you aren't pulling off crazy stunts, and newcomers shouldn't have much trouble with them, especially if you're used to Sonic's unconventional speeds, or at least 3D platformers like I am. For the most part, I think Sonic's levels are fast-paced, fun, and satisfying in this game. They've got a healthy balance of speed and solid platforming, and include numerous exciting set pieces to spice things up. Speed Highway definitely comes to mind immediately for me, and it's a poster child for everything it does well in the level design department. It starts off with a bunch of twisted, winding highways, which look cool by the way. Side note, but I love how this game blends its more fantastical platformer elements into the environment in clever ways. It makes the game feel more like a world and less like a bunch of floating blocks, which gives it way more personality. Anyway, the opening portion of the level features a quicker high path that's more challenging to stay on, much like the Genesis entries, and when you reach the stage's midpoint, you get this really awesome set piece where Sonic runs down the side of a building at a blazing speed, ending off in him crashing through the glass ceiling of the atrium below. From here you enter the At Dawn portion, which is fun to play because of the hidden items you can find like extra lives. Several other levels, including Emerald Coast, Red Mountain, Final Egg, and more succeed just as much in this regard. That said, I don't really care for Casinopolis because I find its objective of collecting 400 rings really slow and boring, or Sky Deck, which I just find way too janky to be fun. Windy Valley's last segment is also a bit overly automated, but hey, I like the visuals and music in this part. Although, now that I mentioned it a bit here, Sonic Adventure carries over the exploratory elements from the previous games. Not something people usually say about this game, but I'd argue there's a solid amount of hidden items to incentivize looking around every nook and cranny. I will concede that the levels themselves are a bit less open-ended than those of the Genesis games. At the very least, the split paths are essentially different brief segments rather than longer portions of the levels. But I wouldn't say those games having branching paths made them non-linear per se, and instead just gave players options to traverse otherwise straightforward areas. If you really look closely at a lot of the level layouts from those games, they definitely have alternate routes, but they all pretty much go in the same direction and all converge at the same endpoint anyways. Where the exploration comes in, then, is with all the hidden items those games had in secret alcoves and the like. Sonic Adventure is much the same, hiding items around its stages as a solid bonus for looking around, rewarding players who keep an eye out for them. I usually miss these things, because I've always enjoyed playing Sonic games the most when I'm speeding along as fast as I can, but still, credit where it's due. I'm sure those who prefer to play these games with a more methodical, explorative playstyle will get a kick out of this stuff. As much of a banger as this campaign is on a gameplay front, story-wise, it's a bit standard. Don't get me wrong, the whole chaos thing is interesting, and I find the characters' interactions really entertaining, but in terms of the actual story, it's basically the standard Sonic vs. Eggman plot we've seen a million times before. Throughout this campaign, Sonic is pretty much on a wild goose chase after the Doctor. Sonic and Tails first collect the Chaos Emeralds from several of the stages, which Eggman manages to steal in a few bizarre scenes where the heroes just seem to sit there and do nothing as he takes them. What? It does get a little more interesting later on when Eggman starts using his egg carrier.
Behold my floating masterpiece, the egg carrier!
Okay, no memes. I think the delivery on that line is unironically great. Eggman just sounds like he's having so much fun saying it, and I love that. Anyway, Sonic also gets an intriguing flashback that makes the player ask some questions about what the hell's going on. But after this, the story just kinda ends. Sonic goes to Eggman's new base, fittingly named Final Egg, and then faces off against the Doctor in a kinda stupid but not unmanageable fight, complete with really entertaining dialogue.
Get a load of this! Get a load of this! It's no use, give up! See if you can make it through here, Sonic!
After this is a really weird credit sequence where Sonic sings his theme song, which is just okay then? Yeah, the story in this game is pretty weird if you ask me. Not confusing or all that hard to follow, but chock full of weird plot elements, probably due to the dated presentation. But hey, maybe that's just me. I love Sonic's campaign in this game, and without a doubt it's the reason I played this game so much. It's certainly not perfect, and arguably not as refined as some of the previous games. It's also got 2 acts of Sky Chase, which is this sub-game where you fly in the tornado and chase the egg carrier, which I just find really boring, drawn out, and something that just kind of kills the pace. But on its own, I enjoy it a little more than those games. Given how fun they already were, that says a lot. However, as I've hinted at before, this game doesn't just have Sonic. In addition to his stellar campaign, you get 5 other stories to play, all of which see you controlling a different character. Like in Sonic 3, each one also has their own set of abilities, being able to traverse the stages in their own way. A lot of people don't like these multiple playable characters because they feel they distract from the core gameplay. Many would rather just pick a character and play the same game with them like they could in Sonic 3, or would rather the game just be Sonic. This perspective is fairly commonplace with alternate playstyles in these old platformers, and look, I get it. Sometimes games can go too far with it and come off as an unfocused mess. However, I'm very much fine with it in concept if the various gameplay elements are fun in their own right and come together to form a satisfying whole. In the case of Sonic Adventure, though, I've got mixed feelings. I like some of these campaigns, but others not so much, and it's these parts of the game where most of my criticisms come in. I don't think the ideas themselves are bad for the most part, but rather I find their execution varies in quality. You could technically ignore these campaigns and just play as Sonic, which I have done in the past, but since this is a review of the whole game, and the developers spent time implementing them, including putting them on the back of the box as a selling point, it would be incredibly half-assed of me if I were to outright ignore them. So why don't we go through them one by one in the order you unlock them, starting with Tails. In my original video on this game, because yes, this isn't my first time talking about it on my channel, cat's out of the bag, I harshly criticized this campaign for several reasons, finding it to be one of the game's weakest parts. To be honest, after playing the game again for this second look, yeah, I pretty much feel the same way. Tails' campaign is one of my lesser favorite ones for a couple reasons. I do like how he controls, and his movement is fairly satisfying, but that's about it. His story is essentially the same as Sonic's, since, after all, he was closely involved with the Hedgehog during his quest to defeat Eggman yet again. It's not exactly identical, and even has some strengths of its own, like how Tails comes into his own at the end and mans up to defeat Eggman without Sonic's help, in a fairly decent boss fight against the Eggwalker, which is satisfying character growth for him. You even get to see how he met Sonic in a flashback scene at one point. No, I mean that because Tails appears in a lot of the scenes with Sonic, you'll be seeing a lot of the same cutscenes throughout his playthrough, oddly paced dialogue and all. Sure, the exact lines the characters say have been slightly altered, but by and large they're the same scenes, and therefore I don't find them worth watching again. In addition, Tails goes through a lot of the same levels that Sonic does. I mean, hell, you even have to do both acts of that boring-ass Sky Chase sub-game again, which I already thought was really dull and dragged down the pace significantly to begin with. Besides that, Tails going through the same levels as Sonic doesn't sound too bad on its own. I mean, it's just like Sonic 3, right? Well, not exactly. Remember, 2D and 3D are fundamentally different, and so for things to work properly, they require different approaches. Back in Sonic 3, the levels could be expansive, but they were also limited because they played out only on 2 axes. Tails was able to fly and travel over most stage obstacles easier, but at the end of the day, he couldn't completely break these stages in 2 because the fundamental limitations of 2D prevented it. Meanwhile, Adventure has a potentially infinite amount of axes due to it being a 3D game, meaning your movement is much less restricted. With a character capable of flight like Tails, you can imagine what this does to the stage design. See that? You can just totally fly over everything and beat the stage in less than a minute. What's funny too is that these levels are supposed to be a race with Sonic, but this element doesn't make it any harder because, well, as you saw, you barely even have to interact with the stages to begin with, so they're hardly a limiting factor. Therein lies the reason I don't really care for this campaign. I find it way too easy to shatter stages into a million pieces, and it's not like it's the kind of game breaking I find fun, where you skillfully abuse shortcuts kinda like Sonic. It's the shallow and boring type, where the thing you're doing is easy or even trivial to begin with. This right here is the reason why I don't think that a perfect one-to-one recreation of how the Genesis games handle multiple characters in 3D works all that well, because it creates inevitable problems like this that would take an exorbitant amount of effort to balance properly, more than Sonic Team probably has the time and money for. The only feasible way they could have fixed the issue, far as I see it anyway, was to design unique stages around Tails' abilities. This way the stages could take advantage of their unique strengths, which I believe would have led to a more fleshed out and fun experience. As is, I consider Tails' campaign too shallow to be fun, but hey, I love this bit.
You think you can keep up with me? What? He's caught up!
You know, sometimes the best kind of genius is the unintentional variety. Which leads me into the third campaign that you unlock, Knuckles the Echidna. He debuted in the last game as a rival to Sonic, and later turned good after he discovered he'd been tricked by Eggman. This game explores his backstory a little more, explaining how things got to the way they were in Sonic 3. It also shows the starting point of this game's overall plot as well. One night, Knuckles is guarding the Master Emerald as he usually does, when he hears something. Chaos has appeared at the shrine, shattering the large gemstone into pieces. Knuckles attempts to attack him, but the monster is too powerful. It then flees in the same way it did at the start of Sonic's story. With the Master Emerald's power gone yet again, Angel Island falls from the sky, landing in the ocean very close to the shore of the Mystic Ruins. Knuckles, making his way to Station Square, realizes that he has to track down all the shards of the Emerald to repair it, so that Angel Island can float once again, thus setting up the gameplay of his campaign. This is the first one to have, in my opinion, meaningful differences to Sonic's gameplay. It sees you tracking down 3 shards of the Master Emerald in an open-ended fashion, using Knuckles' abilities such as climbing walls and gliding through the air to explore for said shards, rather than reaching the end of a relatively linear stage as quickly as possible. As with the other characters, I like how Knuckles controls. He runs decently fast, his jumps are easily controllable, and while his glide is a little heavy and loose for my tastes, and his interactions with the wall collisions can be a little finicky, Knuckles' mechanics are easy to get a hang of. As a result, I enjoy Knuckles' gameplay. I love collectathon games, as you should know if you've seen any video of mine where I talk about one, so Knuckles' treasure hunting campaign appeals to me almost by default. It's fun for me to track down the 3 shards in every level, which can be somewhere out in the open, hidden inside an enemy, or even buried underground occasionally. There's also a radar which beeps faster the closer you get to the pieces, which helps track them down, so it's not a complete blind search. That being said, I don't think this campaign is perfect by any means. Unfortunately, while Knuckles' gameplay is enjoyable, I feel it doesn't reach its full potential. It's a great idea, but so much more could have been done with it. Much like Tails, Knuckles travels through the same levels Sonic does. His different objective prevents this campaign from becoming more the same as Sonic, but I'd say it still results in some missed potential, as the stages weren't designed for Knuckles himself, and therefore make him come off as a little shallow. It definitely doesn't help that I find the elements included to assist you at tracking down the collectibles a bit hand-holdy. For one, the radar is extremely generous, featuring a very large range of detection. It can track these pieces from damn near a mile away, and since the levels are fairly small, the detection can overlap and therefore de-incentivize exploring the stages as much. Alongside that, the hint system, if you can even call it that, just has to call directly pointing you towards a shard. Because of these things, most of Knuckles' stages can be cleared in less than 2 minutes even on a first playthrough, which for me severely hampers their replayability. After all, what incentive do I have to come back and play them again if they're so easy that I'm pretty much a pro at them from the start? There's also one level for Knuckles I really don't care for in particular, that being Skydeck. I wasn't a fan of this stage to begin with because it's probably the jankiest stage in the whole game, and there's certainly no exception to this with Knuckles. It features a tilting gimmick where you'll have to open doors by altering the ship's pitch or roll with this switch near the top, since Emerald Shards love to spawn in them. Problem is, doing this is really finicky since Knuckles often refuses to grab the switch. Sometimes he just won't even push it, even if you do successfully grab it. Not to mention, if you ever have to glide against the ship's tilt, Knuckles also travels really slowly through the air, which I just find really tedious to deal with, and it's also the only Sonic level to ever make me feel nauseous. Well, at least before I played 3D Blast and Chaotix and stuff, but that's irrelevant. It's weird because I don't have motion sickness by any means. I've been on numerous fast roller coasters and other high motion situations, and yet never once felt the urge to puke afterwards. For whatever reason though, this stage sometimes gives me a headache. One time in particular, it was so bad that I had to stop playing the game for the rest of the day, and on this playthrough I felt the same tinge of unease after I finished the level. This stage isn't unplayable, I can get through it just fine, but the experience of doing so is just really tedious and disorienting for me, so I don't like coming back to it whenever I decide to revisit Sonic Adventure. Not to mention, I also find Knuckles' story a bit silly. Again, the setup is pretty cool, and I also enjoy getting to see Angel Island what it looked like millennia ago, complete with Knuckles getting to see a vision of his tribe back then, but the actual plot elements are kind of goofy and hard to take seriously. For starters, Eggman gets involved in it fairly early on, and somehow manages to convince Knuckles that Sonic is trying to steal the Chaos Emeralds from him. It's the exact same lie he told the Echidna in Sonic 3, the one the Doctor eventually double-crossed him with as he stole the Master Emerald for his own selfish purposes. By all rights, Knuckles should have no reason to trust this clearly evil person, and yet he falls for the same old trick again. He even goes as far as to fight Sonic and Tails again, fully convinced that they're out to do something bad for Angel Island, I think. Oh, come on, Knuckles, are you really that much of an idiot?
Shut up!
Also, the fact we don't get a more in-depth scene of Knuckles with his vision of the past is a huge missed opportunity, because, as is, he barely reacts to seeing his ancient ancestors. Imagine how cool it would be if we saw another side of his character, specifically with how he'd react to such a situation. Such a shame that they didn't do that. Regardless, Knuckles' campaign is one of my favorite parts of the game. I just wish it was more fleshed out to make it more enticing and exciting to replay. I feel very similar about the next campaign I'd like to cover, E102 Gamma. Of course, if we go by the character selection wheel, Gamma is actually the last one of the 6. But I always play him fourth because, well, reasons. This campaign is another one I rather like. As with Knuckles, I find that Gamma's story is well justified, since he doesn't follow the same exact plot and has noticeably distinct gameplay from Sonic. His gameplay style as the first one I'd argue is substantially different. Sure, Knuckles' levels were more open-ended, as opposed to the more linear style Sonic and Tails both had, but Gamma's control and moveset make him feel distinct. Well, Tails and Knuckles also had their own unique moves, but I think you know what I'm getting at here. Gamma looks and feels different to play, whereas the main trio, as I usually call them, add their own mechanics on top of the same general controls and physics. E-102 Gamma is an E-Series robot created by Dr. Eggman, and features an arm cannon as a means of attack. I mean, what robot worth their salt doesn't? With this thing, he can lock onto enemies with his laser pointer by holding the action button, which can then be released to unleash a cavalcade of destruction. Stages also have a time limit, which encourages taking as many enemies out as you can, as doing so refills the timer. I find this at its most satisfying when you're chaining together high combos to get a huge time bonus. What certainly helps is that he can reach decent speeds, like any Sonic character should be able to, so the pace is quick and satisfying. Unfortunately though, I'm not really a fan of his handling. His control is functional, but not exactly ideal in my opinion. For one, his jumps are a bit too floaty for my tastes, and when he leaves the ground he feels a bit like a balloon. Despite that floatiness though, his jump's maximum height isn't particularly high, which to me feels a bit stilted. On top of that, while his hover upgrade is a great addition to mobility, it doesn't carry your jump momentum, and Gamma instead comes to a dead stop in the air for a split second. Oh yeah, speaking of upgrades, because I have no better spot to mention them, there are these unlockable moves that enhance your mobility. Some, like Tails' jet anklet, are optional, while others are required. I like most of them, but Sonic's Lightspeed Dash requires you to stop in place to charge it up, which takes too long in my opinion. This can thankfully be reduced with an optional upgrade, but still, total pace breaker. At any rate, I also think Gamma's ground control is somewhat too slippery. Even at high speeds he turns on a dime, which can make him slightly finicky. Again, I don't think these things push Gamma's control over the edge. I can play as him and still have a decent amount of fun. It's just not my ideal handling is all. Sadly, Gamma's campaign also suffers from a similar issue to Tails and Knuckles. His gameplay is really easy. I don't think it's to a degree that totally eliminates all fun, because Gamma's gameplay is at least a creative idea. However, I still find he holds much less replay value than Sonic because there's so much less to master. In Gamma's levels, enemies are never really a threat for me. Their attacks were designed for a character like Sonic, who has to get up close and personal to retaliate. Gamma, on the other hand, is focused on shooting, so you can lock onto and take most enemies out well before you even need to enter their attack range. You may expect that the timer would be the main challenge then, but that's not the case either. For each level, they give you more time than you'll ever need, since most stages are rather short and enemies don't really provide much challenge anyway. Because of this, I never once run out of time when I come back to these stages, since chaining together combos provides more than enough time to clear them. In fact, I'm able to clear some stages by running straight forward and completely ignoring everything. Check out this run of Emerald Coast.
Frog capture complete.
You see what I mean? Now, I did cherry pick the worst example there, but still, the other stages aren't all that much harder, and honestly never have been for me. I think it has something to do with, again, the game reusing the same levels for all the characters. Much like Knuckles, it ends up working out because I think Gamma's gameplay concepts are solid on paper and executed decently, but the easy difficulty, which I believe is because the levels weren't specifically designed for Gamma to bring out the best of his abilities, severely limits his potential. But hey, I really love the train set piece in Hot Shelter, that part's super cool. Really, just give me a level where you hop around on a moving train, and it's probably going to be one of the highlights of whatever game it's in. I also really like Gamma's story, and it's probably the best part of this game's plot. At the start of the campaign, Eggman activates Gamma, as well as his E-Series brothers, including E-101 Beta. Yeah, if you haven't noticed, they're all named after Greek letters. Eggman is a scientist, so are you surprised? Those sons of bitches can't get enough of the Greek alphabet. Regardless, Eggman runs some trial runs on Gamma, including when he has the robot fight against his own brother. Proving himself capable, he's deployed to go find Froggy, frog, who reportedly ate a Chaos Emerald. When Gamma retrieves him, he witnesses Eggman commit severe workplace abuse against his colleagues, and even stumbles across Beta being brutally modified into a mindless killing machine. These things start to make him question Eggman's leadership, but what really pushes him over the edge is Amy's innocence. He learns empathy, and knowing that Eggman has trapped animals inside his robots, decides to take out all his brothers and sisters to free them from the evil bastard's control. He does so in boss fights that are, well, quite lacking on the gameplay front, let's just say, but the story significance makes up for that. The last one of them is in the crashed egg carrier, and once the deed is done, Gamma sees Beta fly by. That's when he realizes both himself and Beta are also just animals in a shell, so he'll have to destroy both his own and Beta's robotic shells to complete this mission. Gamma confronts Beta, and the two face off in a pretty solid boss fight, probably one of the best in the game. When you begin the fight, Beta deflects all direct fire, so you'll have to take a different approach to damage him. He shoots a bunch of homing missiles, which you'll have to lock onto to destroy, and after this he'll charge at you. That's your chance to damage him, but you have to be quick, because after only a second or so, Beta will go back to being immune. That makes taking those missiles out fairly important, since getting hit by one often causes enough of a delay for his attack cycle to reset. As the fight goes on, his attacks keep evolving, eventually seeing him firing explosive energy blasts at you. It's not the hardest boss I've ever fought, but it's consistently engaging, which is more than I can say for this game's other boss fights. Its place in the story is also very emotional. Gamma isn't fighting Beta for any other reason than to put his brother out of his misery, after the unwilling transformation he went through turned him into a power-hungry madman. Once Gamma frees his brother, a scene follows that's quite possibly one of the most bittersweet in Sonic history. Man, that's powerful, even with the limited presentation. The music, visuals, and even the fade out and Gamma happily reuniting with his brother all come together to form a real tearjerker of a scene. This kind of stuff, as I've been saying for this whole retrospective, makes Sonic stand out. Pretty much no platformers back then were attempting emotional scenes like this, but Sonic Adventure does, and I'd say successfully. It showed that Sonic was a series which was consistently expanding, growing with each and every game. Overall, I enjoy Gamma's campaign. While sure, it's still kinda shallow and doesn't quite stack up to Sonic, I have fun every time I return to it. So why don't we talk about one of the game's worst campaigns? Amy Rose, the pink female hedgehog who debuted in Sonic CD as Sonic's theoretical girlfriend, makes a return in this game. She's especially notable because her redesign was one of the most significant in the series. To be honest, I've never really liked Amy's classic design all that much. She just looks way too similar to Sonic if you ask me, so I welcome this redesign. I also, as I do with Tails, like how they emphasize Amy gaining confidence and coming into her own as a character during her story. And that's about as nice as I can get to with Amy's campaign. But this is probably one of the most boring and shallow parts of the game for me, except even more so than Tails. For one, I kinda hate her controls. I find her turning extremely stiff and awkward, her jumps extremely heavy, and her acceleration sluggish. In addition, her top speed is one of the slowest in the game, meaning she has very little in the way of satisfying and fast gameplay. Making a tight turn also kills your acceleration entirely, unlike the other characters, who could make fairly precise movements while still maintaining a solid pace. At least jumping with her hammer makes you go faster, so I can hardly say Amy's control is completely unbearable, but that doesn't make it fun for me. Amy's levels are also lacking in depth. Sure, I've also been criticizing the campaigns besides Sonic for the same thing, but I think Amy easily has it the worst in this regard yet. Her main gameplay focus is running away from one of Eggman's robots, E100-0. Hypothetically, he kills you if he catches you, but that's never once happened to me because he's not threatening whatsoever. Hitting him with Amy's hammer stuns him for a few seconds, which provides ample time to escape from him, even with her slow top speed and sluggish acceleration. As such, Amy's levels pretty much amount to stopping for a second to hit 0, running away, rinse and repeat until the end of the stage. And with a mere 3 levels, this campaign hardly adds anything to the game. Most of its runtime is bogged down by a bunch of cutscenes, many of which we've already seen before at this point in the game, since Amy is so closely involved with the other characters' stories. Her levels are also padded up the wazoo with slow and tedious puzzles, which is especially true in the case of Hot Shelter. Overall, I think this campaign is just such a slog to get through, and it brings the pace of the game to a screeching halt. I remember somehow enjoying it on my first playthrough, but every time I've come back to the game since then, it only ends up getting worse and worse. Also, screw this whack-a-mole minigame, especially on the original Dreamcast version. Shit's a nightmare. Really though, these pacing issues don't apply only to Amy's campaign. I think this game honestly suffers from them in general. That's not to say Sonic Adventure has the worst pacing I've ever seen, and compared to some other games it's downright breakneck. However, in contrast to the other games in this series, it's a bit of a mess in this regard. For one, it includes hub worlds referred to as adventure fields. I don't think these in and of themselves themselves are a problem, and if anything, I like the life they gave its world, complete with NPCs you can talk to. You can also do this. Yeah, speaks for itself. Sonic Adventure takes place on the mainland rather than just another island, so it was ripe for something like this. It makes the game feel, fittingly, like an adventure. I'm also, like I said, that guy who loves collectathons, so you would think I don't mind hubs in a game. That being said, for a Sonic game, it just feels like padding to me. Even when you do know what to do and where to go, it still comes off as a way to extend the game in my opinion. The Genesis games all went from level to level automatically, which I personally preferred. For me, Sonic games are at their best when they do this, and aren't bogged down by hubs or stuff like that. Sonic has always been a series with a more arcadey appeal than the likes of Mario, and because of this, I think it generally works better with stage-to-stage action. Again, the adventure fields aren't the worst thing in the world, and could have been way more intrusive, but I still would have preferred if they weren't there. One thing I've also been levying criticism at this entire video is the repeated content, and it's all because of how the game is structured. Every character's campaign is confined to their own scenario, which only feature levels where you play as said character. In some ways, I like this. If you don't want to play as the other characters, you don't have to. If I ever feel like coming back to this game, but I only care to play as Sonic, I can just start a new file and do so. However, when playing the whole game, like I naturally did for this review, it creates some noticeable problems with the game's pacing. Since the characters go through a lot of the same levels and experience the same events, you'll be seeing a lot of the same cutscenes and fighting the same bosses over and over again. Speaking of which, the boss fights. Sonic bosses have never really been anything special in my opinion, but in this game, they're especially a joke. You can beat most of them within about 20 seconds maximum, and some in even less time than that, although many have really entertaining dialogue.
Oh no!
As is, the bosses are just kind of boring, which only becomes more evident when you have to fight them more than once across several campaigns. Chaos 4 definitely exemplifies this issue the most, since it's this really slow and tedious fight that can take several minutes, with no way to speed it up. You have to fight him as Sonic, Tails, and then Knuckles. That's definitely the worst example, but it's also the same way for the character battles and the like. Additionally, there's a bunch of cutscenes that appear multiple times throughout the game. I've already mentioned how I find them to be a bit poorly paced, which is only compounded by how many times you'll be seeing them. For example, this one scene where Eggman takes Birdie away from Amy involves her, Sonic, Tails, and Gamma, so you'll see essentially the same exact scene 4 times across all their campaigns. I already mentioned how Tails and Amy feature cutscenes from other stories as well, because their plots are so intertwined with that of the other characters. This is a problem for me because, I'm just gonna be honest, I don't find this game's story compelling enough to hold my attention anymore. Most of the cutscenes see the characters standing around talking to one another, with little in the way of exciting action set pieces that I like to see in these Sonic games. Sure, it was 1998, so you can't expect the most amazing thing in the world, but combine that with the constant gaps between lines and often awkward line readings, as well as the other presentation quibbles I brought up earlier, and you're left with a story that I just lose interest in the more I play the game. This gets even worse in the original Dreamcast version, because it doesn't allow you to skip cutscenes. Seriously, you can mash the buttons on the controller all you want, but they don't do anything, so you're forced to watch every cutscene when loading a new file. This applies to things like the side of a cliff face breaking apart, and even the time stick call explains how an upgrade works after grabbing it. For this reason, I find that version of the game really hard to come back to. Which reminds me, while Sonic Adventure was originally a Dreamcast game, it was also ported to other platforms. I've been making the ports of these games, particularly fan projects, a big talking point in all these videos from this retrospective. Sonic Adventure's ports actually change a fair bit from the original release, so I'd say they're worth diving into. Oddly enough, it seems like most people say the Dreamcast version is the best one, but as I was saying, I strongly disagree with this. I think this is the worst version of the game. It doesn't let you skip the slow plotting cutscenes for one, but it's also capped at 30 FPS, which isn't ideal for such a fast-paced game. On top of that, it's not even a consistent 30, and the game frequently experiences major slowdown, especially when things get busy. Also, and this is the most subjective of all, but still, while I don't mind the Dreamcast controller, its analog stick is a bit too stiff and overly resistant for my liking, which makes the game a bit harder to control. It still plays just fine on Dreamcast, low frame rate notwithstanding, but making quick turns is more difficult to do. But hey, if I can give this version props for anything, it supported 480p progressive scan all the way back in 1998 with the Dreamcast's VGA box, which looks really crisp and sharp when run through the open source scan converter. It's more than you can say for most PS2 games in their maximum 480i resolution, which cleans up like shit, so I'm glad the game supports this. As blasphemous as this may be for me to say, I actually prefer the 2003 GameCube port, called Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut, to the original release. This version came out on both GameCube and PC back then, but I don't own that PC version, so GameCube it is. Sure, this version does have some downgrades, namely the lighting and textures, which look way uglier and less natural than the Dreamcast version, and some notable animation bugs in the cutscenes that also weren't present there. there, but that's where this port's downgrades end. They're pretty much only presentation related things. The GameCube version boosts the frame rate to 60 FPS, which makes the game way smoother. If you ask me, Sonic games should be legally required to run at 60, because it makes the controls feel so much more responsive. Granted, the game still does have frequent frame drops, often dipping back to 30 FPS anyway, but to be quite frank, I'd take that any day over a version locked at 30 that does the same thing. Also, while the graphics were significantly downgraded in the porting process, one exception to that is the models for the main characters. They were all redone to appear way more high poly, and in my opinion they look way better than the chunky original models. Although the lighting on them makes them seem as though they're made of plastic, but that's neither here nor there. Having said all that though, the main reason I prefer this version is because it adds a cutscene skip feature. You have no idea how much this improved the game's pacing unless you play both versions for yourself, seriously. It makes it so much easier for me to replay this game, because I no longer have to wait through those long scenes just to get back to the actual gameplay, the thing I came back to the game for. On top of that, this version also loads way faster. Naturally, because, well, you know.
This looks like a fucking chocolate chip cookie!
Which is always an improvement in my books. Apparently, the GameCube version is really glitchy, but I honestly don't see what many other people are seeing. I don't feel it's any more buggy than the original. This one loop in Emerald Coast is well known for having walls that are easy to clip through on GameCube, but this bug is actually in the original Dreamcast version, just harder to do. Hey, so, I just wanted to interrupt real quick here to say that, I just want to be honest, I could be wrong about that. This video right here was the only evidence I could find of this glitch, like, being in the original, you know, this loop glitch. It could just be someone using the PC port modded, like, but, if you listen closely, right there, you could hear like the Dreamcast loading sound, which is pretty distinct. It could be faked. I don't know. I just want to acknowledge that I could totally be wrong about that, but I mean, to me, this looks like the Dreamcast version. Doesn't look like that other version, both mods or whatever. I don't know. Take it as you will, I guess. I mean, I don't have any reason to not believe that it's in the original based on this, but I mean, I could totally be wrong. So, anyway, back to your regularly scheduled video or whatever. As long as you hold forward during this part and don't press any of the buttons, you should be good. Really, a lot of people accuse this game of being extremely glitchy, but in my experience, I don't think it really impacts the gameplay that harshly. Sure, the game has its fair share of bugs, but most of them are just like animation errors and stuff, and honestly, I don't find it that much more unpolished than its contemporaries. I could totally understand why someone wouldn't enjoy the game because of them, though. If you don't know they're coming, you can run into some collision glitches and whatnot. In an ideal world, none of this would happen, but as is, the things this game gets right are good enough that I can brush it off when I run into a bug of some sort. In addition, the GameCube version also adds some extra side content you can play around with if you ever get bored with the main story. The Dreamcast version had some extras, namely the debut of the iconic Chow Garden, but was otherwise relatively light. Here on GameCube, not only is there that, but also a new mission mode and a collection of Game Gear games. Now granted, mission mode is kind of a mediocre addition and more or less amounts to more back and forth around the game's adventure fields, and I don't like many of the Game Gear games that were included very much, such as Sonic Drift. But I still appreciate that these things are here. It's bonus content for those who want more than just the main campaigns. The Chow Garden alone is extremely beloved, and to this day, many people are begging Sega to bring it back. I'm not one of those people. I'd much rather play this game for the fast-paced action platforming instead of a virtual pet simulator, especially in SA1 where it involves a lot of meandering around the hubs, but I can certainly see the appeal here. The game also has optional missions for each stage, called B&A missions, which task you with doing things such as beating each level in a certain time limit. Personally, I've never felt inclined to do them. I mean, the main campaigns are already fairly repetitive in my opinion, so immediately after beating it, I don't want to play the same exact levels again, you know? As with the other side content, I'm sure someone will get a kick out of these missions, they're just not for me. Anyway, back to the version comparison. In 2011, to coincide with the release of Sonic Generations for the series' 20th anniversary, Sonic Adventure DX was ported to PS3, Xbox 360, and Steam. It was naturally based on the PC version of SADX, except upres to HD. That should make it the best version, but by default, it's probably the worst one. The game uses the GameCube version's textures and lighting, doesn't even support widescreen, and instead puts this hideous purple border around the game, and worst of all, screws up the analog input, making it too oversensitive. While I did criticize the Dreamcast version for several things, at least it controlled well. This release was clearly rushed out in time for the release of Generations, and as a result, the end product suffered. Thankfully, through the PC version, you're able to fix it up and make it the definitive one. If you install better SADX or PKR's mod loader on this PC Steam release, something that's really simple to do, and has countless tutorials out there. They come preloaded with a bunch of improvement mods that well, really improve the experience. You can fix the inputs, enable full widescreen, and even restore the Dreamcast textures and superior palette lighting engine. This unfortunately also restores the old character models by default, which I don't prefer. However, you can thankfully configure it to use the updated models with Dreamcast textures, which is the look I went with, as you've no doubt noticed in all my widescreen footage of this game that made up the majority of this video. So basically, with these mods, this version gives you all the benefits of the DX release, like skippable cutscenes and the higher frame rate, but with the Dreamcast presentation advantages, and plus, a bunch of customizability. It gets a double thumbs up for me. As always, the work that the most dedicated Sonic fans have put in to provide others the opportunity to experience these games better than ever before is really impressive, and I can't give enough props. Alright, so I've talked about the different versions, discussed my issues with the pacing. I think I covered all the campaigns. Okay, I think I'm pretty much done with this game. There's not much for me to talk about. I covered all the gameplay, so why don't we discuss—
Hold on, Froggy, I'm coming!
Oh, god damn it. So, yeah, I've kind of been avoiding it, but there's one more campaign in this game, and oh man is it infamous. I'd like to introduce you to Big the Cat. This My Neighbor Totoro reject-looking ass is an absolute meme, because he's the star of what practically everyone considers the worst part of the entire game. In my old video, I went on an explosive rant, ripping this campaign to pieces. Yeah, but after playing it again, yeah, I basically agree with everything I said there, but I don't have the energy nor the desire to scream in a cringeworthy fashion like that, so I'll just give you the bullet points. Big's gameplay style involves sitting around and fishing for Froggy in a pool of water. Yeah, sounds exciting, doesn't it? Well, guess what? It's not. You all know the rest. The mechanics barely work, the camera's ass, catching Froggy requires flicking the stick in an odd way the game doesn't tell you about, reeling him in too hard snaps your line and kills you, and Big's subplot is pretty worthless and doesn't add a lot to the main story. I mean, did we really need to see what this cat was up to when it's not even remotely interesting? Honestly, why are we even doing this in the first place in this game? It's just so out of place to me, and sticks out like a sore thumb. Sure, while Amy was a chore to play, at least she's somewhat controlled like a Sonic character. Just a really sluggish and slow one. I've heard it's because they wanted to show off the Dreamcast's, impressive water effects. If true, I think that's a pretty weak justification for including such a boring and unfun game mode, you know? I would have much preferred if we got to run around each stage as Big, all the while whacking enemies with his fishing rod. You could have still had the searching for Froggy element, but kept the feel of playing as a Sonic character. Maybe it wouldn't have been great, but I think it would have been preferable to what we got. The weirdest thing to me though was how complex Big's levels actually are. He can access some sections that are exclusive to him, like these underwater tunnels and ice cap, and I just have to wonder why. Why waste so much development time on this mode that practically no one asked for, when that's extra development time that could have just as easily been spent fine-tuning Sonic's gameplay, or even the others like Knuckles or Gamma to be the best they could be. It's just so mystifying to me. Really, that's all there is for me to say about Big. I honestly just hate his campaign. I remember my first playthrough of Big's story was Rage Central, and ever since it alternates between being really long and annoying to get through, or mercifully short yet still incredibly dull. Either way, it's a failure for me. From now on, when I replay this game, I'm probably just going to play all the parts I want to, and then load an old file to fight the final boss. But hey, at least Big's character theme is pretty catchy. Aha, there's something I forgot to mention, the soundtrack. That's something I'm sure many people were waiting for. This game's soundtrack is, like any other Sonic game, extremely good and filled to the brim with banger after banger. Except I think this is where Sonic truly came into his own musically. Yeah, the previous games had great music, especially Sonic 3, but it's here in Sonic Adventure where said music ascended to the next level. Jun Sonoy, who had made his Sonic music debut in the previous game, returns to do the whole soundtrack, and he knocked it out of the park. The music in this game is catchy, sophisticated, and enhances every moment it plays in. Best of all though, because we're on a system that uses discs, the tracks are allowed to use real instruments, including electric guitars, saxophones, keyboards, and more. Because of this, the audio presentation is the best so far almost by default, or at least in my opinion it is. It has a greater depth of sound and is able to get more creative with the instrument choices it makes. I could name numerous tracks that stand out, but there's just too many to list. see, there's so much rocking electric guitar in this soundtrack, which is my favorite instrumental sound by the way, combined cleverly with other sounds in this genuinely awesome mix. In addition, this game also brings back vocal themes and makes them a series mainstay. Sonic CD had one of these for each of its two soundtracks. 3D Blast on Saturn had a vocal theme song, and how can we forget about Sonic R? This game wasn't the first in the series to do this, but if you ask me, these vocal tracks are the best ones so far. Each character gets their own theme like it's an anime or something, and a lot of them are actually really good. They also sound fitting for each character's personality, and feature lyrics that reflect each one's state of mind as well. For example, Sonic's theme, It Doesn't Matter, has confident guitars and vocals that sing about doing what he feels is right. Tails' theme, Believe in Myself, has a more pop-oriented sound and sings about the young fox's desire to be as cool as Sonic, which he hopes to achieve through his own efforts. Then you have Big's theme, which has lyrics all about his worry-free life, fitting for a cat, and guitars that go surprisingly hard. Also, I have to mention Knuckles and Amy's themes. Knuckles' song, Unknown from Emmy, features an R&B rap style where the echidna sings about his duties to guard the Master Emerald. And while the actual lyrics of Amy's theme, My Sweet Passion, are a little creepy, this trumpet and saxophone solo near the end slaps harder than a slap fight championship match. I think you get the picture. Sonic Adventure's soundtrack is absolutely amazing and is right up there in terms of my favorite music in the series. Regardless, once you beat the main campaign, there's one more thing waiting for you. It's one last scenario which acts as the finale to the game's story, wrapping up every loose end. This would become a standard going forward for 3D Sonic, at least for those that are divided into several campaigns. In Sonic Adventure, it's done in a kind of odd way. Rather than a dedicated segment called Last Unlocking, complete with a cutscene demonstrating as much, like these games usually do, you have to go back to the character select, where a new campaign called Super Sonic with a question mark appears. Sure then, I guess it works. In any case, this campaign starts up with the status quo more or less having been restored. Sonic and friends have settled down, with Sonic in particular taking a much needed load off. Everything seems well, and it appears that Eggman's scheme is once again foiled. However, that's not quite the case. As he's relaxing, things start to go off the rails again. Angel Island falls again, even though the Master Emerald is still powering it. Meanwhile, Eggman comes across Chaos, but this time the monster turns on him, which sends him flying towards the grounded island, leaving him incapacitated. Knuckles is confused by why the island has fallen yet again, and suspects it has something to do with the Chaos Emeralds Sonic gave him. He then stumbles upon Eggman, and before he can explain what's going on, Chaos appears again, and the screen fades out as he does God knows what to the two. That's when Tails comes running over to a half-asleep Sonic, and tells him about the developing situation at Angel Island, prompting the Hedgehog to jolt up and rush over there. So yeah, at least initially there's some intrigue. However, I unfortunately think this finale is a little underwhelming all things considered, and that's for a few reasons. For one, there's not really any gameplay here. For the most part, it amounts to running around and triggering cutscenes in the hub world. Granted, they are some of the more interesting scenes in the game, but since this is Sonic Adventure we're talking about, the presentation hurts them significantly. Although the ideas are there. Still though, I don't find this part of the game very worthwhile to come back to, and it's all because of one simple thing. How come there wasn't a big final stage to catch everything off in the game so well? I mean, just imagine it. This game is so focused on a large cast of characters, so you could have them all come together in the end to stop whatever Chaos is doing. You could switch between them in the stage, as they all do something suited to their abilities, culminating in Sonic going for the final assault on Chaos or whatever. That would have been so cool. As is though, we pretty much get a bunch of cutscene triggering and then a single boss fight, and the game ends. I don't know about you, but I find that a bit lame. Well, at least it picks up near the end. Sonic gets a flashback to what triggered this series of events in the first place, specifically to the incident that caused Angel Island to be in its current state. We see the tribe I referenced a couple videos ago when I talked about the backstory of Sonic 3. This group, led by Tikal's father, wants the Chaos Emeralds for their own personal gain and power, completely disregarding the safety of the Chow that live on the island. Tikal tries everything to stop them, but fails, because her father is corrupted by his own selfishness and egotism. This unleashes chaos from the Master Emerald, and he goes on a rampage, taking out the entire tribe with the power of the emeralds in a fit of rage. Sonic is confused by this, but it's clear what this is alluding to. In the present day, Chaos is repeating the same cycle, enraged by Eggman's greed. As such, he's gathering the 7 emeralds again, and plans to use them to power up the same way he did before and destroy the world once again. Starting with Station Square. He manages to get the last Chaos Emerald, transforms into his ultimate form, Perfect Chaos, and actually manages to annihilate the city with a massive flood. Yes, in this game, Sonic and friends technically lose in a sense, and now there's a pissed off water monster with incomprehensible powers on the loose. This whole Eggman versus Chaos thing was a plot point I heavily criticized in my original review because I thought him trying to stop Chaos from doing this was an inconsistency, as he also wanted to destroy the city, but I just got that flat out wrong. Thing is, Eggman only wanted to destroy Station Square so that he could build his empire on top of its ruins, thus allowing him to take over the world. Meanwhile, in his blind rage, Chaos intends to destroy that same world that Eggman wanted to rule, and even betrayed Eggman's trust by attacking and leaving him incapacitated on the island. I bring this up because in that original video I threw a genuine hiss hissy fit over this, when there was a perfectly logical explanation for it that I just glossed over. Hell, I even realized this right before publishing the video, but still left the rant in anyway because, I don't know, I thought it was funny or something back then. Really, that old video has so many problems, but let's save it for a minute. I have a game to finish up here. With Station Square now destroyed, all hope seems lost. However, Sonic is never one to give up. He and friends rush to the city, witnessing the utter destruction caused by the water monster. I love the aesthetics of this place, by the way. The textures are kind of blurry, but for what they're trying to portray, it gets the job done. Perfect Chaos's model does look kind of bad, though, but hey, at least his design is cool. Nevertheless, we then get a moment with Eggman that I actually do still find really puzzling. He comes in on another egg carrier, but this time it's the egg carrier 2. Yeah, if the egg carrier's so good, where's the egg carrier 2? Well, right here. And apparently he had made it in advance just for a situation like this. However, Chaos manages to destroy it in one hit, and was that supposed to be funny or something? I mean, it kind of was, but not for the reasons they intended. It's just a head scratcher of a moment I've never really understood. It would make more sense if Eggman had something different than like just another egg carrier, but you know, it would still be kind of weird. Anyway, Tikal then appears to Sonic and informs him that Chaos's heart is filled with anger and sadness. Using the Chaos Emeralds, he channeled that negative energy, using it to power up into the abomination he's become. This gives him insight into how the Chaos Emeralds function. They're capable of turning their users' thoughts into power, and can be channeled with either a profoundly positive or negative emotion. Obviously, Chaos' situation is the latter. Tikal wants to seal him in the Master Emerald again, but Sonic has a different opinion.
It won't change how he feels inside, will it? His heart will still remain in turmoil, and his anger just won't vanish. He'll just be trapped forever.
So yeah, doing that would be a bad idea, because it would just cause Chaos more despair, thus continuing the cycle of destruction. Instead, Sonic plans to channel positive energy with the emeralds, using them to neutralize Chaos's tormented heart and finally bring him to peace. All the characters come in to cheer Sonic on, and as they do, one of the coolest scenes in the series up to that point plays out. Man, I don't even care that the presentation is limited on that. That's just damn cool. It's like something out of an action movie, which this series was always trying to replicate in video game form. But now with more advanced consoles, they were finally able to fully realize that vision. What follows is also one of the better bosses in the game. The fight against Perfect Chaos is comprised of 2 phases, both of which involve getting up to the top speed with a dash pad, avoiding the monster's attacks, which slow you down, and then jumping into him to deal damage. This needs to be done 6 times, and while I don't find it all that challenging, it's certainly exciting. I already mentioned the visuals, but I also have to call attention to the music. It's none other than Open Your Heart, the game's main theme, performed by Jun Sonoe's band Crush 40. It was their first contribution to the series, and my god is it awesome. And the singing just has this heavy metal hard rock edge to it. Absolutely perfect for such a moment. Unfortunately, one of the 2 phases also plays a relatively generic and forgettable boss theme, but at least the PC version, with the mods I have anyway, moves Open Your Heart to the second one, which is more logical and climactic. In any event, 6 blows to Chaos later, and the monster is finally neutralized. Sonic reverts back to his standard form, and so does Chaos. He gazes upon some chow, and finally at peace, he and Tikal ascend, presumably to some sort of heaven or afterlife. The cycle of destruction has finally been broken, and even though many people likely perish in these events, Sonic and friends manage to put an end to the destruction before it could spread to the rest of the world. The characters celebrate as Tails makes the following comment on the state of the city following these events.
All's well that ends well, right?
Sure, Tails, whatever you say, man. Sonic then runs off into the sunset, his work here done. Overall, I think this ending is pretty great. Even though I thought this final campaign was a bit underwhelming, all things considered, it wraps the game up on a conclusive, satisfying note in the end. Speaking of which, why don't we do the same for this video? By this point, I think I've staked my claim on this game. Well, looks like if I kept anything from the old video, it's the horrible rhyme in the first sentence of the conclusion. Anyway, I think Sonic Adventure was a fairly solid 3D transition for the series. One that furthered its mission to be as boundary-breaking as it possibly could be. It's certainly far from perfect in a lot of ways and suffers from many problems brought on by how old it is. It's not always the most polished, it has tons of things I consider padding, like the repeat cutscenes you can't even skip on the original release, or the recycled content across the various playable scenarios. Some of the character campaigns are undercooked or poorly executed. The presentation greatly hampers the larger story they were trying to tell, all sorts of stuff like that. However, I find it hard not to also acknowledge its many strengths, because the things it gets right, it really gets right. It has an amazing soundtrack that's a pleasure to hear both inside and outside the game. The visuals really try to be next-gen for their time and mostly succeeded. Sonic's campaign is a blast from start to finish and may just be my favorite gameplay in the series I've covered so far. Knuckles and Gamma are also decent fun, the controls and level design for the characters were generally well done, and above all else, it further expanded the series' kick-ass world and characters. It took what the Genesis games did and expands on their foundation. It didn't always stick the landing, but I'd say it was overall successful in what it wanted to do. However, one question still remains. Why did I feel the need to talk about this game again? I mean, at the time of writing this, it hasn't even been 2 years since I did the original review. Well, I think the old video is terrible. Simple as that. The footage looks awful, my voiceover sounds abysmal,
But these stages are generally quite enjoyable. They play incredibly well into the central appeal of Sonic. They're very well paced.
and most of the video was spent being all angry and disgruntled. Let me tell you, back then, I didn't handle difference in opinions in a mature way on the internet. In this redo, I hope I was able to rectify this and produce a more enjoyable product. My goal here was just to share how I feel about this game, being honest and true to myself. Whether or not I succeeded in that goal, well, I'll let you decide. With that said, it's time to move on. Let me tell you, if you thought this video was long, and it was, just you wait till the next one. While the Dreamcast started off strong, Sega had no idea what was to come. In 1999, the successor to the then most popular console ever, the PlayStation, was announced. Upon hearing this, Sega knew it would be their last chance to keep a spot in the console market. As such, development on a new Sonic game would commence, and it was to be the largest, most ambitious one yet. They wanted to make a grand impression, and hopefully launch the Dreamcast into a renaissance. Or at the very least, make a fantastic, lasting impression. I've been looking forward to this moment since the retrospective began, and if you know me, you're fully aware of why that is. So join me in the next video when I finally discuss Sonic Adventure 2. Thanks for watching, and I will see you then.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Fine, thank you.
Oh